The Blackstone River doesn't give up its dead easily. For 8 years it kept a secret buried deep in its muddy banks, tangled in the twisted roots of ancient trees that lean over the water like skeletal fingers. When local fishermen pulled that rotting kayak from the river in late September, they had no idea they were about to reopen one of the most disturbing missing persons cases the county had ever seen. The kayak was split down the middle, covered in moss and algae, but inside a sealed dry bag they found something that would change everything. A camera, journals, and gear belonging to 2 brothers who vanished without a trace in 2015. Caleb and Tyler Bennett were 24 and 26 years old when they disappeared. They were adventurous, full of life, and according to everyone who knew them, inseparable. They ran a small but growing nature channel online, filming their expeditions into remote wilderness areas. The Blackstone River was supposed to be their biggest adventure yet, a 3-day journey through untouched territory that locals whispered about with a mix of fear and respect. But they never made it home. And the man who was supposed to keep them safe, their hired guide, Wesley Crane, walked out of those woods alone, with a story that never quite added up. From the very beginning, people felt something was off about Wesley. He was a local wilderness guide in his early 40s, known around town for his rough edges and short temper. He had the experience, sure, but there was something cold in the way he looked at people, something that made you want to keep your distance. When the Bennett brothers hired him, some locals warned them privately. One older woman who ran the bait shop even told Tyler that Wesley had a mean streak, that he didn't like outsiders coming in and making money off the land he considered his own. Tyler laughed it off. He told her they needed someone who knew the river, and Wesley had the best reputation for navigating dangerous waters. That was his first mistake. The night before the expedition, Wesley sat in the corner of a dimly lit bar, nursing a whiskey and watching the brothers celebrate with a few other travelers. Caleb was showing everyone their camera equipment, talking excitedly about the footage they'd capture, the subscribers they'd gain, maybe even sponsorships if the video went viral. Tyler mentioned they were planning to do more trips like this, maybe even without a guide once they learned the ropes. Wesley heard every word. His jaw tightened. His fingers drummed on the bar top. The bartender later told police that Wesley looked like a man boiling over with something ugly. Envy, resentment, maybe something worse. When the brothers left that night, Wesley stayed behind and drank until closing. He muttered to himself, loud enough for the bartender to hear, that people like them didn't respect the wilderness, didn't respect the people who actually lived there. He said they were just using him, that they'd toss him aside the moment they didn't need him anymore. If you can't stand people like Wesley, people who let jealousy turn into something dangerous, hit subscribe right now. Only manipulators and resentful trolls won't. The next morning, the 3 of them set off just after dawn. The fog was thick, clinging to the water like a living thing. The river was narrow in places, winding through dense forest where sunlight barely reached the surface. Caleb and Tyler paddled in one kayak, Wesley in another just ahead, calling out directions. For the first few hours, everything seemed fine. They filmed the towering trees, the way the mist curled over the water, the eerie silence broken only by the occasional bird call. But by midday, things began to shift. Wesley started making comments under his breath, little digs about how they were slowing him down, how city boys didn't understand real survival. Caleb tried to laugh it off, but Tyler wasn't having it. He told Wesley they were paying him to guide them, not lecture them. Wesley went silent after that, but it wasn't the kind of silence that meant peace. It was the kind that meant something was simmering just beneath the surface. The brothers exchanged a glance. Tyler later wrote in his journal, which was found in the recovered gear, that Wesley was acting strange, that his mood had turned dark and unpredictable. He wrote that they were thinking about cutting the trip short, maybe paddling back on their own if Wesley didn't calm down. They didn't know it yet, but that decision had already been made for them. By late afternoon, the skies opened up. Rain hammered down in sheets, turning the river choppy and wild. Wesley shouted over the roar of the water that they needed to find shelter, but he was paddling faster now, pulling ahead. not waiting for them to keep up. Caleb yelled for him to slow down. Wesley didn't respond. He just kept going, vanishing around a bend in the river, leaving the brothers struggling against the current alone. That was the last time anyone saw Caleb and Tyler Bennett alive. 3 days later, Wesley Crane emerged from the wilderness, soaking wet, exhausted, and alone. He stumbled into the ranger station claiming there had been an accident. He said the storm had been worse than he expected, that the river had turned violent, and that the brothers' kayak had capsized in a section of rapids he'd warned them about. He said he tried to save them, dove into the water, searched for hours, but the current was too strong. He said their bodies must have been swept downstream, pulled under by the undercurrent that the locals called ghost currents, places where the river seemed to swallow people whole. The search and rescue teams deployed immediately. They combed the river for days using boats, divers, even helicopters. They found pieces of a paddle, a waterproof bag with some snacks inside, and one of Tyler's shoes wedged between rocks. But no bodies. No kayak. No definitive proof of what actually happened. And Wesley's story, while tragic, seemed plausible enough. Accidents happened on rivers like the Blackstone. People underestimated the danger. The current could pull you down and pin you under a submerged log before you even knew what was happening. The case stayed open for 6 months, then quietly went cold. The Bennett family was devastated, but without evidence of foul play, there was nothing the authorities could do. Wesley walked free, and that's when things got even more disturbing. Within a year of the brothers' disappearance, Wesley Crane had reinvented himself. He started giving interviews to outdoor magazines about the dangers of the Blackstone, positioning himself as the survivalist who knew the river's deadly secrets. He wrote articles, started his own guide service with a new logo and website, and even appeared in a regional documentary about wilderness safety. He used the tragedy to build his brand, to make himself look like the expert who'd tried to save 2 reckless young men who didn't listen. People around town were disgusted, but what could they do? He hadn't been charged with anything. Some believed his story, others didn't, but they kept quiet. Wesley had a reputation for holding grudges, and nobody wanted to be on his bad side. The Bennett family hired a private investigator, but after months of digging, even he came up empty. The river had swallowed the truth along with the brothers, or so everyone thought. 8 years passed. The story became a local legend, the kind of thing people whispered about around campfires. Some said the brothers were still out there, lost in the woods. Others said the river was cursed, that it claimed lives every few years like clockwork. But most people just forgot. Life moved on. Wesley's business thrived. He trained other guides, led expensive expeditions, and played the role of the wise, weathered woodsman who'd seen tragedy and survived it. He never talked about Caleb and Tyler unless someone asked, and when they did, he'd get this faraway look in his eyes and say it was the one trip he wished he could redo. It was a good performance. If you think people like Wesley, who profit off the suffering of others, deserve to be exposed, comment "Justice for the victims" right now. Let everyone know you stand against liars and manipulators. Then, in September of last year, 2 fishermen were working a quiet bend in the river about 12 miles downstream from where the brothers were last seen. The area was remote, rarely visited, choked with fallen trees and thick undergrowth along the banks. One of them snagged his line on something big beneath the surface. At first, he thought it was a log, but when they pulled it up, they realized it was something else entirely. A kayak. Rotted, split open, covered in river slime and moss, but unmistakably a kayak. They dragged it onto the shore, and that's when they saw the name stenciled on the side, faded but still visible. Bennett Brothers Expeditions. Their hands shaking, the fishermen called the sheriff. Within hours, the site was swarming with investigators, forensic teams, and news crews. The kayak had been wedged deep in a tangle of roots from a massive tree that had fallen years ago, hidden from view, preserved in the cold, dark water. Inside, they found a dry bag that had somehow remained sealed. When they opened it, they pulled out waterlogged journals, a rusted multi-tool, a phone that was too damaged to recover data from. and most importantly, a small GoPro camera in a waterproof case. The memory card was still intact. The Bennett family was notified immediately. After 8 years of not knowing, of hoping and grieving in equal measure, they finally had something. The case was officially reopened. Detectives who'd worked the original investigation came out of retirement, and every single person involved had the same question. What was on that camera? The footage was sent to a specialist who worked on recovering damaged data. It took weeks, but eventually, they were able to pull several video files from the card. Some were corrupted beyond repair, just fragments of color and sound, but others were clear enough to see, clear enough to hear. And what they revealed made everyone's blood run cold. The first clip showed Caleb and Tyler on the morning of the trip, smiling and excited, testing the camera angles. The second showed them paddling through calm water, Wesley up ahead, barely visible through the fog. Normal. Routine. But the third clip, time-stamped just 2 hours before sunset on the day they vanished, showed something very different. The camera was mounted on the front of the kayak, angled to capture both the river ahead and occasional glimpses of the brothers. In this clip, the weather had already turned. Rain was coming down hard, blurring the lens every few seconds. You could hear the brothers breathing heavily, paddling hard to keep up with Wesley, who was now far ahead, barely a shadow in the distance. Tyler's voice cut through the sound of rain and rushing water. He was yelling, asking Wesley to slow down, saying they needed to stay together. There was no response. Caleb said something under his breath, something about Wesley being angry, about how they should have never trusted him. Then the camera caught something that made the investigators rewind and watch again. Just before Wesley disappeared completely around the bend, he turned back to look at them, and he smiled. Not a reassuring smile, not the smile of a guide checking on his clients. It was something else, something cold and deliberate, like he knew exactly what he was doing. The next clip was chaos. The kayak was rocking violently. Water was pouring over the sides. Both brothers were shouting now, panicking, trying to steer toward the shore. The camera angle shifted wildly, and for just a moment, it captured something on the bank. A figure, standing completely still among the trees, watching them struggle. The footage was too grainy and dark to make out details, just a silhouette, motionless while the brothers fought for their lives. Then the kayak hit something hard. There was a sickening crack, the sound of fiberglass splitting. Caleb screamed. The camera tumbled, spinning, catching flashes of water, sky, Tyler's terrified face, and then nothing. The screen went black. The audio continued for another 20 seconds. Heavy breathing, splashing. Tyler's voice faint and desperate, calling for Caleb. Then silence. When the investigators showed this footage to the Bennett family, their mother collapsed. Their father sat in stunned silence, staring at the screen. They had spent 8 years wondering, imagining the worst, but nothing prepared them for actually seeing it, seeing their son's final moments, seeing the fear in their eyes, and seeing that Wesley had left them behind. But the footage alone wasn't enough to prove murder. It showed negligence, maybe, abandonment, but not a deliberate act of killing. The defense could argue that Wesley panicked, that he misjudged the conditions, that he made a terrible mistake but didn't intend for anyone to die. The investigators needed more. So they went back to the kayak. They tore it apart, examined every inch, cataloged every piece of gear that had been inside. That's when they found the hidden compartment. It was built into the underside of one of the seats, a small waterproof pocket designed to hold valuables. Inside, they found a folded, laminated map of the river. On it, someone had written in frantic handwriting, "Help," along with the initials CB and TB. There were coordinates marked, circled multiple times, indicating a location about 3 miles downstream from where the kayak had been found. But what really caught their attention was what else was in that compartment. A pocket knife. Expensive, well-made, with a bone handle. And engraved on the side were the initials W.C. Wesley Crane. The knife was tested immediately. Despite 8 years in the water, traces of blood were still detectable in the grooves of the handle. DNA analysis took weeks, But when the results came back, they were definitive. The blood belonged to Tyler Bennett. Suddenly, this wasn't just a tragic accident anymore. This was a crime scene. Detectives showed up at Wesley's home on a cold October morning. He answered the door in a flannel shirt and jeans, coffee in hand, the picture of rugged calm. When they told him about the kayak, about the footage, about the knife, his expression didn't change. He invited them in, cooperated fully, and maintained the same story he'd told 8 years ago. He said the knife must have fallen out of his pack during the chaos. He said he had no idea how it ended up in their kayak. He said the blood could have gotten on it any number of ways. Maybe Tyler borrowed it to cut rope. Maybe there was an accident he didn't even notice. He was calm. Too calm. Like he'd been rehearsing this for years. When they asked him about leaving the brothers behind, about the smile on the footage, he said they were misinterpreting things. He said the storm had disoriented him, that he thought they were right behind him. He said he'd spent hours searching, nearly died himself trying to find them. And when they asked about the figure on the shore, the one standing and watching, Wesley's face finally changed. Just for a second. A flicker of something. Fear, maybe. Or recognition. He said he didn't know anything about that. He said it was probably just shadows, a trick of the light, a tree stump that looked like a person. But the detectives didn't believe him. And neither did the district attorney. Wesley Crane was arrested and charged with 2 counts of manslaughter and tampering with evidence. The media exploded. The story that had been buried for 8 years was suddenly front-page news. People who had taken wilderness courses from Wesley came forward saying he'd always been arrogant, dismissive, that he talked about tourists like they were a plague on the land. Former friends admitted they'd suspected him all along but were too afraid to say anything. The town that had once tolerated him now turned on him completely. If you believe people like Wesley deserve to face the consequences of their actions, hit that like button right now. Only cowards and bullies would let someone like him get away with it. But just when it seemed like the case was closed, just when it seemed like justice was finally in reach, something happened that nobody expected. A man walked into the sheriff's office on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Wesley's arrest. He was in his late 40s, tall and lean, with the same sharp features as Wesley but softer eyes. He told the receptionist his name was Daniel Crane, and that he had information about the Bennett brothers' case. He said he was Wesley's younger brother, and that he'd been on the Blackstone River the day those boys disappeared. The room went silent. Daniel Crane hadn't been seen in the area for over a decade. He'd left town after a falling out with Wesley, moved 2 states away, and cut off all contact with his family. Nobody even knew he was aware of what had happened. But here he was, sitting across from detectives, hands clasped on the table, ready to talk. What he said changed everything. Daniel explained that 8 years ago, Wesley had called him out of the blue. It was the first time they'd spoken in years. Wesley told him he was guiding 2 young guys down the Blackstone, said they seemed reckless and disrespectful, and that he had a bad feeling about the trip. He asked Daniel to follow them, to stay out of sight but keep an eye on things just in case something went wrong. At first, Daniel refused. He wanted nothing to do with Wesley or his paranoia. But Wesley kept pushing, said he'd pay him, said he just needed backup because the brothers were talking about ditching him halfway through and he didn't trust them not to get themselves killed. Finally, Daniel agreed. He thought maybe it was a chance to reconnect with his brother to help him out and move past the old grudges. So he packed his gear, drove out to the river, and hiked along the ridge that ran parallel to the water. He stayed hidden, watching from a distance, tracking their progress through binoculars. For most of the first day, everything seemed fine. He saw them paddling, stopping to film, setting up camp. Wesley seemed tense, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then the storm hit. Daniel said he lost sight of them in the rain and fog. He tried to keep up, scrambling along the muddy ridge, but the terrain was brutal and visibility was near zero. He heard shouting, heard the brothers calling for help, and he ran toward the sound. By the time he reached a vantage point where he could see the river, the brothers' kayak was already in trouble. It was spinning in the current, taking on water, and they were desperately trying to paddle toward the shore. And Wesley was nowhere near them. Daniel saw him upstream, pulled off to the side, kayak beached on a sandbar, just standing there. Watching, not moving, not helping. Daniel screamed at him, but the wind and rain swallowed his voice. He watched in horror as the brothers' kayak hit a submerged rock and split apart. He saw them thrown into the water, saw them struggling, grabbing for branches, for anything. And he saw Wesley turn away. Daniel said he made a decision in that moment. He dropped his pack and climbed down the ridge as fast as he could, slipping and sliding through the mud, trying to reach the water. But by the time he got there, the current had already dragged them downstream. He waded in as far as he dared, calling out, searching, but it was too late. The river had taken them. He never saw them surface. Shaking and devastated, Daniel climbed back up the ridge and found Wesley sitting by his kayak, completely dry, staring at the water like nothing had happened. Daniel confronted him, demanded to know why he hadn't helped, why he just stood there and let them drown. Wesley looked at him with empty eyes and said they'd brought it on themselves. Said they were arrogant, that they didn't respect him or the river, and that nature had a way of correcting mistakes. Daniel said he'd never seen his brother like that before. Cold, detached, like he'd justified it all in his head before it even happened. Daniel told him he was going to the police, that what he'd done was murder. But Wesley grabbed him, told him that nobody would believe him, that it would look like two brothers with a history of bad blood trying to destroy each other. He said if Daniel said anything, he'd make sure Daniel went down with him, claim he was an accomplice, that they'd planned it together. He reminded Daniel that he'd asked him to come, that there were phone records, messages, proof that Daniel had been there. And then Wesley made it clear that if Daniel walked away and kept his mouth shut, this could all just be a tragic accident. No one had to know. Daniel was terrified, he was ashamed, and God help him, he stayed silent. He left that night, drove home, and tried to bury what he'd seen. He told himself that without bodies, without proof, his word wouldn't be enough. He told himself he'd be risking his own freedom for nothing. But it aided him every single day for 8 years. When he saw the news about the kayak being found, about the footage and the knife, he knew he couldn't stay quiet anymore. He had to tell the truth, even if it destroyed him too. The detectives recorded every word. They verified his story, checked phone records from 8 years ago, and sure enough, there were multiple calls between Wesley and Daniel in the days leading up to the trip. They brought in a forensic analyst who compared the figure in the recovered footage to photos of Daniel, and the height, build, and posture matched. Daniel Crane had been the shadow in the trees, the man watching from the woods, but he wasn't there to help Wesley. He was there trying to stop something he didn't fully understand until it was too late. The prosecution added Daniel's testimony to their case. It was damning. It showed premeditation, showed that Wesley had orchestrated the situation, isolated the brothers, and let them die. But Daniel wasn't off the hook either. He was charged as an accessory after the fact for covering up the crime for 8 years. He accepted it. He said he deserved worse. The trial began 4 months later. The courtroom was packed every single day. The Bennett family sat in the front row, holding photos of Caleb and Tyler, their faces carved with grief and exhaustion. Across the aisle, Wesley sat stone-faced, dressed in a cheap suit, his lawyer whispering strategies that everyone knew wouldn't work. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution presented the recovered footage frame by frame showing Wesley's deliberate smile, his refusal to help, the brothers' terror in their final moments. They brought in the pocket knife with Tyler's blood still detectable after 8 years underwater. They showed the map with the desperate plea for help scrawled across it. And then they put Daniel Crane on the stand. He sat there for 3 hours, tears streaming down his face, and told the jury everything. He described watching his brother abandon 2 young men to die. He described the guilt that had hollowed him out for nearly a decade. He admitted his cowardice, his complicity, and he begged the Bennett family for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. The defense tried to paint Daniel as a liar, a jealous brother trying to frame Wesley out of spite. They argued that the footage was inconclusive, that the smile was a grimace of fear, that Wesley had truly believed the brothers were behind him. They claimed the knife had been lost innocently, that Tyler could have borrowed it days earlier and cut himself without anyone noticing. But nobody believed it. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on both counts of manslaughter, guilty of evidence tampering, guilty of leaving 2 young men to die in freezing water while he saved himself. When the verdict was read, Wesley didn't react. He just stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as if he'd already accepted this outcome years ago. The Bennett family sobbed, not from joy, but from exhaustion, from the weight of finally knowing the truth. The judge sentenced Wesley Crane to 30 years in prison, without the possibility of parole for 20. As the bailiffs led him away in handcuffs, a reporter shouted a question, asking if he had anything to say to the victim's family. Wesley stopped, turned, and for the first time in the entire trial, he spoke directly into the cameras. He said the river keeps its secrets and that people only see what they want to see. He said there were things that happened on the Blackstone that nobody would ever understand, things that went deeper than anyone realized. Then he was gone, dragged through the side door and into a prison transport van. His words hung in the air like smoke. People dismissed it as the ramblings of a desperate man trying to sound mysterious, trying to plant doubt where none existed. But some people, the ones who knew the Blackstone, the locals who'd lived near that river their whole lives, they heard something else in his voice. They heard fear. Daniel Crane was sentenced to 5 years for accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice. He didn't appeal. He told the judge he'd spend the rest of his life trying to make amends, even though he knew he never could. The Bennett family said they didn't forgive him, but they understood that he'd finally done the right thing, even if it came too late. The case was closed. The media moved on. Wesley Crane became another cautionary tale, another monster who let greed and resentment turn him into a killer. If you stand against people like Wesley, people who destroy lives out of jealousy and selfishness, then subscribe right now and let the algorithm know we don't tolerate evil. Only hateful people would